All right, let's sew up this Circe swim top. This is a fully lined top, so you want double of everything, double of the right side, double of the left side, double your ties. I'm self-lining everything, as you can see here. So I'm gonna do one side in the stripe, one side in the solid, same with the ties. And that's what we're gonna start out sewing first is these front bodice pieces and the ties together. I sped it up a little bit because it's just me pinning them together, right sides together on both sides. You want to make sure and align them at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's a really small seam allowance, and so it's really easy. It's not far off from the very edge. And we're going to repeat with the lining pieces. Just exactly the same thing, right sides together with the waist ties and the front bodice pieces. I'm doing the thicker tie option here, so where they meet is nice and thick. I'm doing a youth size though, so smaller pieces in general. Okay, now that we have all of these attached, you can top stitch. You know, I really like to top stitch these just so that the seam allowances are nested really well. So I like to press my main pieces one way and my lining pieces the other. I used a triple step zigzag because that's what I plan on using for top stitching the rest of the bodice. It's my favorite swim top stitch. It's nice and stretchy and easy to use. It's pretty from the front and the back, which is important on things like the ties, where you want the front and the back looking nice and pretty. Okay, now what we're going to do is lay out our bodice pieces like we're going to wear them, right sides up, and we're going to attach the back at the shoulder seams. So we're going to put right sides down so that the pieces are right sides together. Pin and stitch at the shoulder seams. I love to use pins on swim versus clips. That's because they can slip and slide really easily when you're taking off, especially certain swim fabrics. My solid swim fabric here was a super slippery one. The stripe one was actually somewhat of like a seersucker type texture. It was a seersucker swim, and so it was nice and easy and not slippery. But if you have a super slippery fabric, I highly recommend using pins versus clips. The pins you can leave in there, especially if you pin it, you know, at 3/8 of an inch and our seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. You can leave it in there as it takes off and make sure that it's not going to slip and slide as you're taking off. You can also kind of use the pins as an extra finger to really get in there nice and close, way closer than you can get your actual finger in. Just to make sure it's not slipping and sliding as you're taking off or at the end of it either. All right, so we have attached all the shoulder seams on the main and the lining, and now we're going to attach the main and the lining together. You can top stitch these shoulder seams as well, again, just to make sure your seam allowances are nice and flat and nested. I chose to skip that one, but you can do it. Laying out my main fabric right sides up and my lining fabric right sides down. I again self-lined, and so my main and my lining are exactly the same. All right, once again nesting those seams, meaning the seam allowance goes to the back on my main pieces and to the front on my lining pieces, and this just helps keep the bulk at bay. If you press your seam allowances both going to the back, you're going to have double the seam allowances on that section. It's just going to be a little bit more bulky. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to pin, and then after pinning, baste around almost all these edges. We're going to do the arm size, which is like the armpit through shoulder area. And then we're going to do all along the neckline, which on this one is very long since it goes all the way down the ties. So I'm just pinning first, and then I'm going to baste along all those edges. Baste is the longest straight stitch your machine can stitch. Usually it's a stitch length of 5. And it is just a temporary hold. So we just want to baste because it holds it together even better than pins. And swim fabric tends to be super slippery and not want to stay in place. We're going to be sewing together these 2 layers plus elastic. And so to keep anything from slipping while we're attaching the elastic, I highly recommend basting. Even now, after sewing swim for years and years, I still baste. Anytime I think, you know what, it's fine, I'm just going to skip that baste. It takes so long to baste. I've sewn so many swimsuits, it's going to be fine. If I try to attach the elastic before basting, there's always a little section that gets off, that slips, that doesn't catch all the layers plus the elastic. And it's just not going to have your perfect seam allowance either. So take the time to baste. It's worth it every time. I regret it any time that I skip the basting. So don't rush it. Baste. You will be happy if you do, and you will regret it if you don't. So don't skip the basting. I'm going to speed up my video just a little bit because the pinning and the basting is a little bit boring. But once again, don't skip it. Again, the basting stitch is just temporary. It will not stretch. So once you have sewn your final stitch, attaching the elastic and these with a stretch stitch, it's okay for those basting stitches to either be removed, or what I tend to do is just stretch my fabric, let them pop, and I leave them in there. You can remove them. I highly suggest, if you want to remove all of your basting stitches, to use a really high contrast color thread. That way they're easy to remove once you have stitched your final stitch. Personally, I just pop them and leave them in there. You do want to pop them before you try it on though, because if not, they will pop as you stretch to put it on, and that might be frightening. Also, if you don't pop them before you try it on, they will pop as much as needed to get on, but it will still feel much tighter than if you go ahead and pop all of those stitches, allowing the fabric to really stretch as much as it can before trying it on. So if you try it on and you forgot to remove your basting stitches, you forgot to pop them, you'll hear them popping. Don't panic. If it feels tighter than it should, take it off. Stretch your swimsuit all around all the edges where we basted and pop all those stitches, and then try it back on. Now we're going to attach the elastic. I'm not going to go into too much detail about attaching elastic because I do have a separate video all about attaching elastic if you need help there. What I'm doing now is I'm just stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down this little end of the tie, stitching it nice and closed, and that's just because I like to see that 1/4 inch seam allowance really nice and easy. I do not like to put elastic in this little seam allowance, so you can see I line up the edge of my elastic right to that seam allowance, and I pin first clip because I can leave this pin in until my needle hits that elastic. I'll try to get a good, nice little close-up of this. Make sure your blade is off if you're using a serger like me. So I just keep going right here until, hand cranking with the needle in, until my needle has gone through the elastic. So now my elastic is held tight and it's not going to slip and slide as I take off. The elastic is just going to align exactly to the raw edges of the fabric. We're not taking anything off here. It's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, exactly what your serger does automatically. If you are using a sewing machine, just use a high stretch stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is what it looks like on the serger. It should fully enclose your elastic just like that. We are not stretching our elastic and we are not easing it in. The word you'll hear over and over and over attaching elastic is you hold it taut. So if you are attaching elastic and it's making your garment swim top, that's what we're doing now. If it's making your swim top wavy on the edges, if you lay it flat after you're done attaching it and it's all wavy, it won't lay flat anymore, you have eased in your elastic. So you have either stretched your swim fabric as you attached, or you just weren't holding your elastic taut enough. Okay, you have too much elastic. If you pull it off your machine and it is gathering all of your fabric up, you have held it too tight and you have accidentally stretched the elastic. This is a really tight curve here. You just want to make sure your swimsuit is going in nice and straight as possible. You just want to shift your swimsuit over and over until it's feeding into the machine nice and straight, and just keep your elastic the same, nice and taut. If you are new at attaching elastic without a guide telling you how long it should be, I highly recommend using your sewing machine and basting it on. That way you can pull it off. If it's wavy, you know you need to trim some elastic off, hold it a little more taut. If it's gathered, you know you need more elastic. As you can see, I don't pre-cut my elastic. I am just pulling it off my roll. I order a giant roll from Amazon because I love sewing swimsuits and I sew them all the time. So I don't even trim my elastic. I just do it by feel and then trim at the very end. I highly recommend, again, basting it first, making sure you're happy with your elastic and the way it looks and the way your garment is looking before trimming it and before doing your final stitch. I'm pretty confident in doing it, so I haven't basted it in a while, but when I was learning, I always basted it. Highly recommend basting it if you are unsure of how tight to hold your elastic. And you can see here, I talked earlier about using a pin as a finger. So my end wanted to slip off here, and I couldn't really get my finger in there, so I used my pin to get it in place and hold it so that it wouldn't slip off the end there for me. There we go. Now you can bust through your basting stitches now, or leave it all till the end, whatever you prefer. And now we're just going to repeat the same thing along the arm size. Now these are pretty curvy, and you want to make sure you're not easing in extra elastic. So feed in your swimsuit nice and straight into the serger, and don't let it curve too much. Hold it nice and taut, or else your armpits aren't going to want to hug your body. Again, I highly recommend basting and making sure that your swimsuit pieces are looking like they did before. It should not change the shape of your pattern pieces at all once you attach your elastic. Again, I like to stop 1/4 of an inch away so that my elastic is not in the seam at the armpit. Just like that. You can see it's not wavy, it's not gathered, it lays nice and flat, just like it did before I did the elastic. And now we're just going to repeat on the other arm side. If you need more help on attaching elastic, I have a link in the tutorial that is all about attaching elastic in swimwear and underwear. So go ahead and click on that. It's on the first few pages, along with a few other links about swim fabric, swim supplies, different kinds of elastic, all of those kind of things. So if you're a beginner with swim, you can go check out all those blog posts and videos. One other thing about attaching elastic is you want to attach it all on the same side. So whether you're attaching it to your main side or your lining side, I always attach it to my main side, and that's so that I can never accidentally attach one arm side the wrong way. It just lays slightly different, and so you want to make sure that they all match. You're attaching it either all to the main or all to the lining. Again, I always do the main, but just pick one and stay consistent through the entire top. So along the neckline, arm size, and then again along the bottom, you just want to make sure you're attaching it to the same side on all the edges. All right, now we're gonna flip this right sides out. I love to use a little bodkin, I think is what it's called. It's just a little turning tool. And so you just grab onto it. You can also use just a safety pin. Grab onto the end of the waist ties. And then the same front piece that you grabbed the waist ties to, you're gonna go through the front piece, through the shoulder seam. And this is why I like to use a little tool, because it's really tight here, especially on the youth size. And this makes it go way more smoothly if you use a little turning tool, rather than trying to stick your fingers in there or anything like that. If you haven't pulled your basting stitches, this will pull those basting stitches. They'll pop them anyways. Go nice and slowly. Your fabric stretches, so it should come through pretty smoothly, even though it is a tight squeeze. That fabric right there will stretch a little bit, and it shouldn't be too big of a battle, but you will have to go nice and slowly. But you know what? It'll be worth it when you have a gorgeous, gorgeous inside and outside, or even a fully reversible top. I did not make this one reversible. I just lined it. It would look exactly the same flipped inside and outside because I self-lined. But you can make two completely different looking tops if you use, say all pink for the lining and all stripes for the main. You would have a completely reversible top. Otherwise, you just end up with a beautiful finished top. We're just going to repeat on this other side. Again, just grabbing the very end of the ties. I always fold them kind of, accordion style, so that they're nice and thin as possible to feed through. And I'm going to speed this side up since it's not very exciting to watch me just feed it through. Once we're all flipped right sides out, what we're going to do next is sew up the side seams. So I think it's easiest to just kind of lay out your bodice front and back exactly how it will be worn. Making sure the straps don't get twisted at all. Everything is right sides together. So again, I used the same fabric for my main and lining. It really doesn't matter if you're putting your lining together or your main together. Again, it's a fully reversible top, so it shouldn't matter. You just want to make sure your straps aren't getting twisted. Okay, we're going to open up our side seams just like this and pin all along, matching the bottom edge of the lining bodice, the bottom edge of the main bodice, and then the little armpit seam. On one side of our side seams, on the lining fabric, you're going to leave a little hole. And we're going to use this later on to flip it right sides out in the end. So I'm marking right here on my lining fabric where I'm going to leave a hole, and that's just to remind myself to leave the hole. Sometimes I forget. If you do forget, it's not the end of the world. You can just use a seam ripper to pick out a little hole. But since you're watching the video and sewing along with me, don't forget. Again, here's your side seam. Just going to line everything right sides together, then open them up and pin all along. Now this side seam we're going to sew all the way up the whole way. You only need to leave a hole in the lining of one side. It does not matter which side you leave the hole in. Just pick one. It does not matter. You do want it to be in your lining fabric though, and not your main fabric. Okay, I'm going to sew these up, and then we'll be moving on to the next step. Here is the side where I did not leave a hole, and then you can see you can just fold it back down at the armpit seam. Sew up this one with the hole in it. You can see I still use my serger. You can use your sewing machine to make a nice crisper hole if you need. The 1/4 inch seam allowances, it's all right to use your serger. And again, I'm just finger pressing it at the armpit area. All right, we're gonna lay it out nice and flat. And now we're gonna do along this bottom edge. So we're gonna kind of open it up and tuck these straps inside. There we go, and align all of these seams. So here's a side seam. And we're just gonna pin all along the bottom with the straps tucked inside. And I'm gonna tell you to baste, of course, these two together. And then we're going to attach elastic. So I'm gonna speed up this pinning and basting because it's nice and boring once you see me tuck the straps in. That's really the only important thing here to note. So otherwise we're just aligning right sides together, the main and the lining fabrics all along this bottom edge. All right, now we're ready to baste. And again, I like to baste with a long straight stitch. I baste at about 1/8 of an inch, so it's inside my little 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just leave the threads in there after I pop them. All right, now we're ready to add in the elastic into this seam and do our final stitch. Again, I like to leave the elastic out of that little edge of 1/4 inch. I like to use a pin. Start it off nice and slowly, leaving the pin in there until the needle is down. That just ensures that that elastic is not going to slip and slide. If you remove your pin and then take off, most likely the elastic is going to slip and slide. Again, holding my elastic nice and taut, not pulling and stretching it, but I am not easing it in either. I have my blade off and I am just attaching it along the edge so that the elastic edge and the raw edge of my swimsuit are all aligned. Again, I stop a 1/4 inch away from the edge so that it's not in that seam allowance right there. And there we go. I'm just popping my basting stitches, you can see me. And then we'll go to flip this right sides out. All right, here we're gonna flip it right sides out using this little hole in the lining we left. Depending on how big of a hole you could leave and how big your waist ties are, what size you're making basically. The waist ties thin down, very thin on all sizes though, even the adult sizes. Not so where you're tying your swimsuit, your ties aren't really thick and bulky. I love to use this tube turner. It makes this much easier. I really love my tube turner. If you don't have one, I highly suggest grabbing one. It is a very nifty little turner. It makes things like this so much easier because you can try to use a safety pin or another turning tool like a bodkin, but there's nothing like this tube turner when you have to turn these long finished ties, okay? One end is nice and pokey, so you can kind of use it as I am right here, kind of poking my square ends out nice and sharp. So it's kind of a double duty, and then you can just kind of pull it through. Again, depending on how big of a hole you left, you might need to take your time pulling it through nice and neatly. And now I'm just gonna go through the hole again to the other side. Again, using my tube turner, I stick the rounded edge in. If you don't know how to use your tube turner, maybe you snatched one up and are trying it for the first time, you put in your rounded edge all the way to the end, and then you clamp it down, and then you slowly start rolling it toward the other side. This is the trickiest part, this very beginning. Once you get it started, it's nice and smooth and easy. Sometimes it's hard to get it to clamp down and to kind of twist at the very beginning. All right, so once we're started, you're just going to keep on keeping on until you're all the way through. It should be nice and smooth from here on out. Pop, there we go. And then you use that sharper side to, if you need, you know, this one has a square end, so the sharper side helps kind of poke out. It's not too sharp that it's going to poke your fabric at all, but it's got a sharper edge. And then you just pull through that little hole. Again, if it's a smaller hole on a smaller size, you're going to have to kind of go slow and work the magic. Pop, there we go. All right, now we're almost done. Looks like a fully reversible swimsuit already. All we need to do is close up our hole on the side seam, and you can top stitch if you like to top stitch. I am going to. I like a top stitch. I feel like it makes the ties look really nice and neat, and it just keeps it laying nicely. To close up this hole, all you're going to do is press in your little seam allowances here. Again, I just finger press with the nylon. You can press your fabric if it can hold a press, but be careful if you have a nylon. Always use a pressing cloth with nylon and a very low temp, or it will melt. So I'm just going to pin it here. I'm going to make sure the pin is nice on both sides because you are going to be able to see it. Now you can hand stitch this closed with a ladder stitch if you don't mind hand stitching. Personally, I hate hand stitching. This is a side seam. It's going to be under the armpit. I just top stitch it closed. Does not bother me. If you want it absolutely beautiful on the inside and the outside, you can absolutely just do a ladder stitch. It's not that big of a hole. I'm just a little baby about hand stitching. I use a triple step zigzag, the same that I used on top stitching the other seams that I've top stitched so far, and the same stitch I plan on top stitching the rest of the edges in. You can use whatever stitch you like the look of, though. That is a stretch stitch. Even though this is a vertical seam, you still want a little stretch to it because swim fabric does stretch vertically as well. And since the fabric can stretch, it will stretch. And if your stitch doesn't stretch with it, it will pop. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this. That is an optional add-on. If you like top stitching, you can top stitch. If you don't, you don't need to. If you lined your fabric in a different fabric than your main, though, I do recommend top stitching because it helps keep it aligned how you want it to be aligned. So if you use, say, a swim lining for lining the bodice pieces, you don't really want that poking out. I self-lined, so really you couldn't tell if the lining poked out or not. I just like the way the top stitch looks, and I feel like it makes those little ties kind of lay really nicely. So I top stitch, but I do not always top stitch, and you definitely don't have to always top stitch. I am going to show a little trick here. I am not going to show me top stitching this entire top because it does take quite a while to top stitch, which is why some people choose to skip it. Besides, they might just not like the look of it. I'm going to show this very edge though, because it is a little bit tricky doing these teeny tiny little ties. And so I'll show you how I do that. I usually will grab a pin anytime I need to do something that my machine might not want to feed through. So I'm here at the very edge. There's nothing I can kind of tug on the back to help it through. So I usually grab a pin and I will stick it in kind of horizontally. There we go. And I can put a little pressure on it, pushing backwards to help get it started so it doesn't get stuck. Just a little tidbit if you're having trouble at the end of those ties kind of turning. And I thought I would show a little bit of the straps. The straps, especially on the youth sizes, are very narrow, just like the ties. Your stitching might overlap depending on your stitch width. That's okay, no big deal. Overlap the stitches. There should be plenty of room for the elastic to sit side by side in the straps. I say plenty of room. There is enough room for the elastic to sit side by side in both the straps and the waist ties, but it is just enough for the elastic to sit side by side. This little tight curve, again, you want to go around that little tight curve. It can be kind of tricky if you are new to sewing swim and tight little curves. If it doesn't look perfect off, it will stretch on the body and it will probably look better being worn than off if you are struggling with that tight little curve. All right, here's my finished top. Fully reversible, gorgeous on the inside, gorgeous on the outside. I hope you had fun sewing along with me with this Circe swim top. I can't wait to see yours, so please don't forget to share with us, tag us, let us see your beautiful Circe swim tops. I love sewing swim, and I hope you had fun sewing up yours. Bye, y'all.